What's up, guys, and welcome back to the last episode of Robo Replay of the year. And basically, what I'll be doing this entire episode is trying my best to make a guide of what happened throughout all of 2025, or at least hit like the important parts for what you can take into for next year, as well as give hopefully a somewhat base standard area for any new people to FRC interested in strategy of what happened last year and just like generally looking at how strategy evolved, how strategy tends to evolve throughout the year, and what lessons we can take from last year into 2025. Before we get into the video, I do want to give a quick disclaimer regarding AI. So if you're not interested in this or don't really care, then feel free to skip over this. I'll leave a timestamp that you can just skip over this little message with. But I have been seeing a lot of rise in AI, whether it be thumbnails or descriptions or titles on YouTube, and they're fairly easy to spot. And to me, using AI on a platform such as YouTube, which is like a creative platform where it's kind of designed to allow you to express yourself or just show off the idea of human creativity and human skill, it kind of feels disingenuous to me. It feels kind of crappy to see that like a video of people that I'm interested in um, has like is clearly using AI and they're not putting in the effort. And so I'm just gonna say it right now. I am against using AI and that kind of stuff because I feel like it it's kind of like having like a fake Louis Vuitton bag. It's just like, why can't you just put in the time to make the effort to try to come up with something for your videos? And so I'm just saying right now, before anybody asks about it, I do not use AI for any of my thumbnails, descriptions. What I say is all human created, and I promise I won't use that going forward. But with that out of the way, let's get into the 2025 season of what happened, and we're going to be starting with Kickoff. As you might notice, we're looking at a little sheet here that Team Rembrandts have made. They do this every year, I think, for as long as I've been keeping track of it. It's always very helpful, and what they do is, on Kickoff, they end up just taking all of the really hard ideas for us to just visualize in one page and just putting it down and having it a very, very easy way for us to visualize how the game might look, how the game might be played, and you can simulate all that kind of stuff on here. So thank you to them for always putting this out. This is a really helpful tool that I think everybody should be using. It's always up on Chief Delphi, or at least that's where I've seen it for the past couple of years. And I'll be using this to try to walk us through what you might have a reaction to as in Kickoff and how teams thought of stuff as Kickoff versus how it changed as the year went on. So, starting off, the way that you want to win, the way you win matches in FRC is obviously through points, right? The more points you score, if you have more points than the other alliance, then you end up getting a win. That is basically the general idea of every match, but except for the fact that there's also RP, right? And so what RP means, as we can see it here, a win gives you 3 RP, tie gives you 1 RP, and then all these different things give you 1 RP each. And the idea of RP is that you're not going to immediately be playing matches to win them yet at the start of your event. That'll happen at the playoffs. But to get to playoffs, you want to have a way to rank every single team at the event. And that's where we do the qualification matches. So you'll end up playing a bunch of matches with completely randomized teammates throughout the entire event. And basically, you just want to get as much RP as possible. Now, obviously, we can see winning is a big part of that, right? This year, winning was worth 3 RP. But there's other tasks, like all these different tasks here, that also heavily make up your RP. And so, if you want to rank first, and the reason you want to do that is because then you get the first choice of who you want to play with in the playoffs, which hopefully means that you then have a really powerful alliance to go win the event with, then you want to rank high in RP. And so going into Kickoff, one of the biggest things that people look at every single year is this idea of weighting. How much do you want to focus on RP? How much do we want to focus on actually winning the match? And are those two things different? Where are they similar? All that kind of jazz gets put in together. One of the biggest things that was interesting this year in my mind is how easy the RP actually ended up being. Because we saw this throughout the season as well, but when you look at a requirement of RP at the start of the season, and you say, okay, well, this is how much the auto RP is worth, or this is what it takes to get it, this is what it takes the barge RP to work, this is how much it takes to get it, this is what it takes coral RP, right? My first reaction to seeing that information is immediately just, what do I let me play out a match of this game in my head to like some reasonable expectation of like what week 3 might look like. And what does that look like? And so when I was looking at the game this year, looking at auto RP being all robots leave and at least one coral is scored, in my mind I'm like, wow, that's a really easy auto RP. That's a really easy RP. So if it's such an easy RP, then most teams should be able to score it, right? And so then when I'm looking at the idea of what are teams going to be separated by, and like the top of the standings of every event, when you see that the barge RP is just 14 barge points, which if we check the end of the match points, the deep cage is 12 points and a park is 2. Park is something you should be getting every single time because it's just driving there. So that's a really easy task to complete. If the deep cage isn't that hard, as we ended up seeing most every robot ended up just going for a deep cage because there's no reason to go for a shallow cage, then the barge RP also becomes really easy. And so then you end up realizing that, well, the only difference is with the how you're going to end up ranking at the top of the event is, one, are you winning your matches, right? Do you have 3 RP throughout the entire event? And are you confirming the 2 RP that are really easy? And so in my mind, when I start to look at this kind of stuff at the start of the season, one of the first things I like to think of is, how much average RP do I think like the top 4 teams at an event might have? And if that answer is like, well, I think that most teams should be ended up winning it. I think that this can be like at a high 4 point something because of the fact that the auto RP isn't that hard, the barge RP isn't that hard. So, and if a team is really good and they're going to be ranking high, they're going to be winning the most of their matches. So they'll be around 5. Maybe they'll drop a match or 2. So they'll be like at a 4 point something, right? So whatever arbitrary number that is, that's really important to keep in mind in just saying, because once you look at those 2 RPs as like pretty easy RPs to get, then that last RP and dropping matches becomes really, really hard. So in my mind, when I looked at this game, I was like, okay, so because of the fact that RP is so easy to get, right? These 2 RPs are essentially freebies. If you have a deep cage climb, if you have all partners moving and no one's broken, right? These 2 RPs are essentially freebies. So what does that make more valuable? Well, that makes coral a lot more valuable, and that makes winning a lot more valuable. So then that leads me to think, well, I want to make a robot that, instead of maybe focusing on RP, like last year specifically, 2024, sorry, there was a lot of emphasis on, well, should we do the trap? Should we not do the trap? Is this worth it for the extra RP? And we ended up seeing a lot of teams just ignore it altogether, which led to a dead RP for a lot of the early parts of the season. And then that made that RP ultra valuable, because if you're able to do that task, because most teams left it alone, then you essentially got an extra RP that you could get compared to everyone else. So just the idea of looking at RPs, looking at how the different dynamics of how easy they are, how hard you think they might be, and looking at how that weights what different tasks might end up being worth, I think is a really interesting thing to consider when you're looking at what do we want our robot to be good at, right? And so immediately, in my mind, it's like, okay, well, coral's really important because that's the 1 RP that's not really guaranteed. Winning's really important, and how do you get wins? Well, it looks like there's a lot of coral to be scored. There's really easy cycles for coral to be scored. And so the gut reaction for most people, and I think we saw this, right? Most people ended up just making coral robots, which I think is a perfectly valid conclusion to come to, like, right? Like, this is all really, really easy line of reasoning to go through. And I think that this is the type of stuff that you should be doing on your kickoff just to make sure, like, yeah, okay. Just make sure that you're at least weighting the options, especially if next year we have a 2 game piece game again, and they make 1 game piece not obviously more advantageous in terms of RP than the other. I think it's really important for you to weight, what does this game piece do for me versus this game piece? And so looking at the teleop specifically, right? The way that most people scored points in this game was mostly through the teleop. Obviously, auto did matter a bunch, but teleop was really where a lot of the scoring happened. And so if we look at tele, we see processor, this didn't really count. right? Because basically the way the processor worked was that you get 6 points, but you also lose 4 points every time or you give the other alliance 4 points every single time that they just throw the ball into their own area, which was seen as a almost guaranteed thing. So this really wasn't an option for most people, but it was an option if you were trying to go for like a niche little like trying to flood the processor, then that was a strategy that you could have gone for. But what most people ended up doing was just saying, okay, we're just going to ignore the algae in the processor. And if you look at algae in this sense, you see, okay, well, what does algae have going for it? Well, you have the competition bonus, so it makes it so you get better ranking. But other than that, there's kind of more coral to be scored. There's faster cycles for coral than for algae, and coral seems like it even gives more points overall. And so when you look at that and you see, well, it looks like coral's just the easy task to do, then that's the type of thing where if you're going to an early event, I'd say absolutely build a robot for coral, because that's the type of robot that is going to do really well early, because there's not enough locations to be bothering with the algae cycles yet. However, if I was looking at this game, and this is something that my coach came up with, was that the fact that the algae scored in net might end up being a really important piece down the line. And her reasoning for that was the fact that, well, everybody's going to be focusing coral, right? But once you're done with the coral in L4 and 3, now algae ends up becoming actually more valuable than the L2s. And looking further down the line, you'll see that probably most people are going to end up scoring all the L3s and L4s at some point throughout the season. When that is, that's up for you to decide. But then that's when algae becomes really important, because it's now a neutral game piece. That's one of the biggest things to point out this year, is that all the game pieces were neutral. This wasn't the case in 2022, but it wasn't really the case in 23 and 24 because of the way that you kind of collected them. But because of the fact that these are neutral game pieces, and algae can bounce around a lot as a ball that bounces and roll around across the field, this now becomes a really important game piece to keep control of later down the line. And we absolutely saw that happening, right? And we saw certain teams, like 1153 comes to mind, where they designed their robots specifically for this later part of the season, where they're like, well, we think algae is going to be really important, but it won't be that important early in the season. So we're going to design a robot that can at least do the coral to a solid level. L2s and 3s are really good at cycling them, but we're going to make our robot big on algae. And what ended up happening for them? They ended up being, the second alliance in their district championship field. They ended up getting a silver medal for that, and they also ended up going to Worlds and played a match 3 in finals of their division to make it on Einstein. And sadly, that didn't happen because of breakages or whatever. But the fact remains that they did their job as a really good niche robot, a robot that filled their niche really well, and it got them to such a high position, right? So if you're looking at your team as a team that you don't think can compete with the powerhouses around you that are just going to be ripping coral, and you just can't compete with that, then looking for a niche, I think, is a really, really big way to get that advantage and potentially even get picked at the world level, and honestly even make it to Einstein's, right? This is the type of strategic reasoning that ends up bringing teams to such far places, and it all happens at the kickoff. Now, I want to go into week 1 because we've talked a lot about kickoff, but I want to show you guys how strategy actually evolved throughout the season. Because although kickoff is like the 3 most important days of your season, as Karthik said, going throughout the season can also really, really help you if you're able to predict what might happen at your event by looking at what happened in events prior. So let's do that. So here we are. We're at the ISR district event. This is the first event of the year that was played for district ranking and potentially world's qualifications, right? Week 0 doesn't really count in that regard. So this is the first event that was getting played that was playing for something. And immediately off the rip, I want to point out something. 5614 does a really good job here of reading the rules. I think this is also one of the big things that everybody should be doing. Like, obviously, yes, read the rules, figure out what you're doing, but reading the rules for what you might be able to use to get an advantage is what really takes these teams over the top, especially in pick and place games where, as a game, its design is about finding the smallest edge you can and completely exploiting that. And so we'll see here that 5614 has their bumper barely on the starting line. And as we saw before, right, a lot of teams just end up with like, well, we're going to have our entire bumper inside the starting line. We're going to have portions of a robot inside the starting line. The 5614 reads the rules really well and takes us to the limit where they're like, we are barely going to have our bumper corner inside the starting line. And if you watch them throughout this auto period, they actually end up pulling out an extra game piece just because of the fact that they're able to rotate themselves in an easy way and save that movement. And so we'll see that they get two pieces, and as they go for their third, time's just about to run out, and they put their third, which wouldn't have happened if they had to waste extra movement, setting up like Orbit did, to go turn themselves and then go, right? So all of these tiny little things are really what add to each other, not only in these pick and place games, but also in shooter games. You can absolutely see the tiny things making a difference. Another thing I want to point out, 1690 would end up being a Worlds finalist. Their immediate reaction to this game was, well, you can either have consistency from scoring on the station, or you can have a lack of consistency, but you can pick up from the ground, which could be really good for some extra cycles, because you end up having to move less, which gives you more cycles, obviously, right? And so 1690 decides, well, we don't really care about the consistency because we think that we can just pick up the pieces off the ground anyways, and it's going to be enough of an advantage where chasing down the pieces does not seem to be a concern for us. And another thing I'd like to point out from 1690 here is that they kind of, I don't know if they're like the first people to do it, but they're the first people I noticed doing this. They invented this thing called a super cycle, where they would essentially score a piece, as we just saw, and they would pick up an algae and also have a coral picked up as well, so that when they go to do their algae cycle, because obviously this is kind of inefficient as an idea, because of the fact that you're not able to just run over here and go cycle more coral, and instead you have to spend your time going up here, putting it in, and then going all the way back. These guys decided to pick up an algae and try to score it in. Obviously it doesn't work in this instance, but they then go score the coral without having to take the extra time to do that extra piece of coral. I think that this ends up becoming a really, really big thing later on, and we'll see that for sure as teams end up realizing how good this idea is. And so also another thing I want to point out, at early events, this is a week one, you will often see teams run two offense, one defense, almost no matter what the game is. Like 2023 was a year where I think it was probably one of the worst years for defense in recent memory. I think this one, there was actually some solid opportunities and people did show that it was like somewhat viable, but not really. But 2023 was like very, very bad for defense. And people still ended up running a bunch of defense just because of the fact that when teams aren't really prepared in terms of having enough time on the sticks, like just pathing in general hasn't really been made yet, or like standardized in a way by a really good team, so you kind of have to just do your own thing, innovate, then people end up just putting another robot to distract other drivers, because it's just a really solid way to do that at early events. And also the fact that at really early events, teams normally aren't finished with their robot yet to enough of a degree where you'd want your third robot to actually play offense with you and take up that space as a scorer instead of taking up that space as defender. So that's just a strategy that I've seen used every single year. It's a good thing to keep an eye out for. If you have a good drive base and have a solid driver and an understanding of the rules, I think that you can get picked by almost any alliance at a week one event. Now, the last thing here is, this is one thing that I think made everybody sort of see why ground intake can be so incredibly powerful, is the fact that Orbit was getting the pieces to end up like very, very far towards the reef, and so they almost didn't have to move. And we'll see that innovated on by 3023 later on. But like this idea of like having a very small cycle is going to be it's going to be taken to the extreme, as we'll see soon. But if we skip to the end of this match, one of the biggest things was that we were talking about how deep cages were supposed to be very easy, and this was kind of a development that happened throughout throughout the build season rather than throughout comp season. But going in, everybody kind of just agreed that the shallow cages weren't really worth it. And there was some people, I don't know which group it is, I'm very sorry for not knowing, but some people ended up deciding to make like an every bot climber, which basically got the deep cage on most of the time if you lined up correctly. You can see 6090. They have like these little forks on the end here, which a lot of people ended up using. And it basically just got you a guaranteed 12 points if you spent the time in the match to just go do it. So deep climbs ended up being really, really, really useful. Right. Another thing I want to point out that we'll be talking about later is this idea of a deep team having a deep cage here, even though they might not need it. And we'll see how that gets changed in week 3, which is what I'll be skipping to next. And just showing you guys what the world champs, 1323, as well as a divisional finalist and one of the best teams in the world, 5940, end up doing, and showing how they innovated upon this kind of idea and took it forward another step in week 3. All right, so here we are in week 3. This is the finals 2 of Silicon Valley Regional. This is basically just worlds ended up being winners and a division finalist, Fred and 1323, two incredible robots. And something that we'll immediately note here that's interesting, that I think that everybody should keep this in mind through next year, is look at how auto paths develop, right? At the start of the season, we saw with the 1690s that they just had one robot going like this. This is what the majority of teams were doing, and you just had your third robot be in the middle. Maybe you move forward, you do like a little coral, maybe you do an algae if you're feeling really special, or like you have a good enough middle auto. But other than that, it was just, you do the standard just bounce on the edge, two robots that are strongest scores, and the middle person kind of just sits there. 1323 had a really interesting idea where they took pieces off the ground to keep that consistency that they were missing from having to go to the station. So if we see here, all 3 of these coral pieces that they're about to pick up and score were all scored from a like set position, right? So they're basically just found a way to make it so that the problem of consistency doesn't really affect them in the slightest. And another reason, right, if you can figure out a way to take a problem of a certain type of system and instead get rid of that problem and you keep the benefits of that system, it makes it a lot better. And this is just the type of stuff where if you're playing out matches in your head with different like theoretical robots, that this is just a really good way to think about the game at kickoff, like throughout the season when you're thinking about what kind of system do you want to design. But then if we look at IntelliOp, we immediately see there's a difference between the way 1323 was going out and scoring pieces and the way that Orbit is scoring pieces. Because we could see immediately that the 1323 human player is kind of just throwing the field all over with coral, right? Because of the fact that they've basically just said that we saw what Orbit was doing, and we thought that that was an interesting idea, right? You have the coral bouncing somewhat closer, but what if we did it more? What if we just threw all the coral on the field so that it bounced next to each other and kept hitting itself forward, and basically just made it so that 1323 would barely have to move for a piece of coral? Because in our mind, we don't really need to score every single piece of coral on the field. It's kind of fine if there's some that are left pretty far away, or like in positions where you might not see them, because we're not at the position where we're going to score everything. So that's fine. We don't really care. So we'll use the coral to make our cycles even faster at the price of extra coral, which we're not going to use. So again, another innovation that they made and looked at 1690s and said, you know what? We can do this better. And obviously, I don't know if they were the first team to do this, but they were the first team that I remember pulling this one out. So I decided to include them here, as well as the fact that they were the world champs for a reason. Right? These guys are always innovating on the way that they like to play the game, and we'll look at that in Einstein's as well. And then even here, we can still see it's a week 3 event, but they just have a third robot playing defense on the side. Just not only because of the fact that defense is like somewhat doable in this game, but also because when they see there's a defender on their side, it's just really beneficial for them to just clear space by having a robot not be on their side. And in that way, they have an easier time to score on the coral. And we can see that already we're starting to see how much L1s are starting to get value, right? Because of the fact that once you're done with all the branches, well, L1s become really valuable. And this is what ends up actually being one of the main strategies of 1323 at Worlds, is the fact that in playoffs, they literally only scored L1s. They didn't do a branch a single time because they trusted their partners to just get those done anyways. So in that way, it's another indication of like how we can see the game progressing and see how future games and future matches can take these high scoring matches at the time, and we'll be using these types of strategies further along. And in 2025, I think it's a lot harder to look at, but I think that if you want to go back even further, look at 2024, how the amp was being used, how like the different timings were working of that, I think that's a really clear example of how um, as we got further along and people watched what other people were doing in their events, it became really clear what the optimal way of using the amp was and innovating upon that. Whereas in this game, I think there's definitely some innovation being done, but a lot of it is being gated behind the fact that you can't really do the innovation until you have a certain amount of scoring that you can do already, right? So the idea of, well, we can't really innovate on the fact that we want to stack our L1s this way because we can't get there because we can't score enough game pieces in the first place. Or we can't really innovate on coral pieces flying all the way close to us for easier cycles because we don't have a ground intake. We have a normal intake of like just a funnel or whatever. So a lot of this is data behind there, but even then I think it tells an important story of looking at robots that are like you, seeing what they're doing that's interesting, what's working, and how you can improve on it, I think is a really important part of any team's strategic development throughout the season. So, next up, I want to focus on, I talked about earlier how important algae would end up becoming, and how as a neutral game piece, it's like really important. So, we're going to be looking at Jack in the Bot and how much they prioritize that as the other world winners that we'll be taking a look at here. So, starting off here, we're looking at most teams were ending up just doing their standard 1, 2, and then 1 in the middle in terms of autos. Jack in the Bot does something really interesting. I don't know if they're the first people to do it. I know RoboTiers did it at some point. I'm not sure if they did it at the same time as Jack in the Bot, but Jack in the Bot is the one I remember because I was watching this match live. So I'm going to point out them as well as the fact that they won Worlds, right? So basically what they do is they say, well, what are the benefits of being in the middle? Or what are the costs of being having a robot in the middle? Well, you get a really easy pathing for that third robot, or second robot, two strongest robots, to just go score from like this, right? It makes it so you get a lot more coral because you're able to get to the stations. And Jack in the Bot says, well, what if we made it so that these guys could get to the stations, but we were just really fast at getting to the backside and use the fact that our ground intake will always have a consistent place to score to our advantage. And so take a look at Jack in the Bot's auto here, and look how fast they rip out in front of their partners to score that coral, and now they're able to maximize the amount of coral that they get in terms of the auto. The reason that maximizing auto coral is so important is not just the fact that, right, getting more coral on is good, right? Obviously, cycling is good. But the fact that every single one of these L4s is worth an L4 teleop cycle, right? As well as an L1 teleop cycle, because both of these alliances are so good to where they're both going to fill all the branches, they're both going to do the algae. What's left to determine the match? Well, it's just L1s. And so if you're scoring an extra L4 or an L3, because of the fact that this is like essentially just a 5+2, with the 2 bonus being added from the auto modifier, you've essentially just put yourself up an extra cycle by being able to put these extra L4s on, right? And you can see on the other side as well, 9450 does do a similar type of thing. And so this thing is definitely getting used throughout. It's definitely seeing use if teams are able to do it. Another thing I want to point out, at this point, 2910 realizes how important algae is, right? I think most people in the world have realized how important algae is starting to become, because as you're filling more of these branches up, what's the difference between alliances? Well, it's how many L1s can you score, and are you putting your algae in the reef because it's worth 2 L1s? And people have found out that spending the time of putting 2 L1s is not the worth is same as doing algae, unless you're a team like 1323 who's able to just do 2 1s at the drop of a dime, right? And so we can see 2910 is so determined on doing their algae first that they even get a penalty over there because of the fact that they're so adamant on chasing this. And this is another thing that developed throughout the season, which is the fact that because it's a neutral game piece and you can steal it and these things bounce a lot, it ended up making it so that when you were doing the algae, you could see right here, right? So if you miss an algae, it often ends up rolling to the other side of the field, and allows the other team to other alliances to score it. And so 2910 thinks that this is so important, this idea of denying algae from the other alliance, that as the best scoring robot on their alliance, they're going to be focusing algae, even though doing coral is probably a faster cycle for them specifically. Right. And the reason for this is, again, the fact that we're looking at point differentials. I think this is another concept that I think people should understand in terms of pick and places specifically, when there's limited resources. But it could also apply for your shooter games, depending on how that might end up working out. Is this idea of point differentials? So basically, if we're assuming that both these alliances can score at a relatively even level and cycle in a similar level, then you've essentially said that there's a certain amount of coral that both these alliances are going to cap at, right? Whatever this X amount of coral is, that both alliances are going to cap at, they're going to score. In an ideal world, both these guys are going to do the same amount of coral. What's the differential then? Well, obviously we have the deep climbs, but as we noted before, those are pretty easy, and most alliances are just running 3 deep climbers at this point, because of the fact that most events have 3 deep climbers at this point, because we've gone to a pretty far point in the season. Then what's the difference? Well, it becomes algae. Algae is a really big difference. In this match, we'll end up seeing that this alliance will only end up getting 8 out of their potential 9 algae, and because of that, these guys will end up being able to take an extra algae. What does that mean? Well, if we're assuming that both alliances are similar, it means that these guys have now gotten a 4 less potential points to score, right? So they're now down 4. And these guys have gotten an extra 4 potential points to score, which they have ended up scoring. As we can see, it's 10 algae on their side. So what that means is this one algae piece that was made is now causing an 8-point swing, right, in point differentials. And 8 points is also worth 4 L1s. So being able to deny those types of game pieces, and looking at neutral game pieces as very heavily important, I think is a really good skill to look at, as well as looking at games in a sense of point differentials and point swings and how that might affect the way that you want to prioritize game pieces. In this case, 2910 thinks that denying algae from the other alliance is a really good idea. I agree with them as well, because both these guys are going to end up finishing their reefs most likely, so there's just no reason to not deny. Another thing to notice, we've gotten to the point of the season where defense is kind of fallen off, and the deeper and deeper you get into a season, the more you see what the strategies are actually going to be, rather than people are just running 2 offense, 1 defense because they want to have more space on their side of the field. Another thing here, we see 2910 again go over and steal an algae just because of the fact that they want to make sure that these guys don't have an 11-7 algae lead, which is basically a 16-point swing, instead of the 8-10, right? So they go over to the other side, sacrifice some time just to deny that potential point swing. And at the end of this, it does end up not mattering the amount of algae they scored because of the fact that the auto went so well for them, and they end up winning the match as well as the entire event, not only because of the fact that the deep climbs didn't go through, but also because of the fact that their coral was simply better, even though the other alliance did end up getting that 8-point swing, as we noted before, with the algae. So, again, you can look at really high-scoring matches to see what might be the norm in a potential future match. And we'll see that absolutely play out at the top level of the game, where on Einstein's, 1 stolen algae basically decides the whole game. Let's take a look at that. So, starting off here, something to note, I will point out, 1323, since the start of the playoffs, has basically only been doing L1s and algae. They have not scored on a branch, as far as I remember, a single time when I was watching them, because of the fact that they were just so adamant on the fact that their partners would score all the coral on the branches, which they did. Of course they did. They ended up winning Worlds. On the other end, we can also see that they're doing this kind of backside auto that, whether they created it, 2910 created it, Roboteus created it, I don't really know who made it, but the point remains that it's a really strong auto. And we can see that they end up actually pulling out a lead compared to the other alliance, with their auto being able to go on the backside. And on the other side here, we can see that the Red Alliance has decided to go with this standard, we're just going to take an algae off the middle because of the fact that we can't really do anything else during our time in auto, so we're just going to deny an algae from you guys getting a piece of algae on there, just so that we can end up, securing our algae, because algae does end up being really important, right? And one of the biggest reasons that they're actually not able to go for this backside auto is because of the fact that you can see that these algae are dropping. It's because both these robots end up taking some of the pieces off the ground there. Because again, taking stuff off of just human player throwing it in auto is really inconsistent. We, as a design, all of these robots want consistency in their collections, so they're going to end up taking that backside as well. And so, going from a game at the start of the season that was pretty incredibly Coral favored, I think most teams in the world were just playing Coral, to at this point, we can see literally every single robot realizes how powerful algae is as a game piece, right? Every single robot on the field right now is doing algae or supercycling in some way, right? 4414 is do supercycling right now, but they're going to do algae because denying that neutral objective is really, really important. And so we can see 2910 realizes how important this is. We saw them do it before, and they go gun for a piece of algae, pick it up, and now they have that 8-point swing in their favor, right? You've denied, especially when both of these alliances probably can score a similar amount, if not more, Coral than anybody on the other alliance, right? Both these alliances have the potential to just rip the entire game piece with the field worth of Coral. So even one piece denied is really, really strong. And so with an 8-point swing over here, right, you get the +4 over here of potential points being scored, -4, especially when both alliances are capping out the game. We'll see that this ends up actually really mattering at the end here. So if we move forward a lot more, then we'll see that towards the end of the match, you can see that even though the Red Alliance is actually up by 2 Coral, right? They've outcycled them at this point. And whether you can, I would attribute some of that to the fact that 2910 spent some time getting this algae, right? I'm sure they could have done an extra like 1 or 2 cycles in that time. But the fact remains that these guys are ahead in Coral. But because of the fact that these guys on the blue side had that 1 extra algae, they're still up by 2 points, 4 points rather, as we can see here. And going towards the end of the match, that extra algae ends up making the Red Alliance really desperate for an extra point, because of the fact that they know that unless they beat them by 2 more cycles than the last, in terms of like Coral value, right? Unless these guys are ahead by +2 in terms of Coral L1s, they can't make up that differential, as well as the fact that Newton ended up actually getting an extra piece off in auto, which is another cycle +1 that they're going to have to compete with. And so at the end, High Tide has to go for something risky, ends up knocking 2 game pieces at the end. But again, this just comes down to, because of the fact that the Blue Alliance was so far ahead in terms of cycles, because of that 1 algae they picked up and that 1 extra piece they did in auto, that it ends up forcing the Red Alliance to have to do this, right? Another thing to note is when I say so far ahead, obviously you can see in the score, it's pretty dang close right now. Like I say so far ahead, but I think this is one of the biggest things in pick and place games is that once you have 2 alliances that are relatively even, in pick and place games specifically, every single second that you spend like barely adjusting for a little bit more optimal becomes huge. Because when in pick and place games, often games who are with even alliances, especially such as these ones, end up coming down to who has that tiny extra second in them that they can steal away or optimize in that 1 bit. And I think that's why these teams end up doing so well compared to the other teams that obviously are capable of doing competing at an incredible level and could be here in the finals. But the reason that these guys make it is because they're able to do that optimization so well. And I think that's one of the biggest keys of doing well in a pick and place is figuring out how can we optimize, not only at like the micro level that some of these guys are doing, but also in like how can we optimize our driving paths? How can we optimize the way that we want to collect game pieces, like off the ground, right? All this kind of stuff, and just thinking about optimizing your robot is one of the biggest things, I think, and keys to being successful in any FRC season. So obviously, next year, people have been talking about being a shooter game. People don't think it's going to be pick and place. So because of that, I did want to end off this 2025 recap with a video of the 2022 season, because of the fact that I think it might be a shooter game, and there's some interesting things to take away from 2022 specifically, which is what I'm going to show. So here we are, 2022, 254, 3175, 1619. All teams I'm sure you've heard of if you're older in FRC. If you're newer to FRC, 254 is like, how would I 254 is like the LeBron of FRC. They've done it all. They're just very, very good at what they do, and there's always something you can learn from them. So we're going to be taking a look at them specifically in the way that their alliance plays the shooter game, and I'll give a basic rundown of the rules. But basically, all you need to know is that you shoot the color of balls that your alliance is, and the other alliance shoots the color of balls that their alliance is. They go inside this big thing here, and they come out, and it's basically an infinite amount of scoring that you can potentially do, right? And so the idea of this game is you can literally run around anywhere. There's only 2 safe zones for you to score from, and they're not particularly optimal, so defense was pretty solid in this game. And I want to take a look at 254's auto in particular because I think they do something really interesting that people pointed out, and they caused a rule change actually, or like a change in the way that people worded the rules. So off rip, take a look at 254. They're going to send time, picking up that extra ball on the red side, and just fling it over to their side. The reason for that is because when you're able to push a ball that's not your alliances onto the other side, it just makes it a lot easier for you to deal with it, right? These guys have less potential options for scoring because of the fact that this ball is now here, right? Because you've now denied an extra piece of points that they would have to now run all the way over here to collect. Another thing that I think 254 did, whether you think it's legal or not, whether you think it's controversial or not, the fact remains that it wasn't called on this 254 throughout the entirety of Worlds, was the way they did their collection and auto. So basically, the way you'd normally do collection and shooting, and most people did, was that you'd collect 2 balls because you were only allowed to have possession of 2 balls at a time, and you'd fire them, and then you'd go collect the next one, and then you'd fire them, and you'd collect the next one. So 254, the way they did it, and the way they interpreted the rules and read the rules and found this little loophole, is that they saw that if you didn't control a ball for more than like 3 seconds, a third ball rather, an extra ball, for more than 3 seconds, then you were able to just shoot it. So they shoot 3 balls at once because of the fact that they didn't possess it for all that much time. And now, because of the fact that they cut down that extra second, they're now able to go into that final 2 things, 2 balls being shot out of them, and putting those in as auto ends, and also being able to deny that red ball at the end that High Tide would have most likely wanted to go grab. So again, it's these little optimizations, reading the rules for those little kinks that you can pluck out that really get you a long way. And so immediately 254 sees an opportunity to take a red ball and throw it out again. And again, whenever there are objectives that you can pick up, game pieces that you can pick up that your opponent wants to take, I think it's always, always, always a good idea to look at how those might interact. Whether it be like 254 does, where they literally just pick it up just to shoo it away so that it's harder for the other alliance to reach, or whether the way their partner does when they're playing defense, which is you literally are just going to sit, pick up 2 balls, and you're going to play defense because you've now denied them 2 extra potential scoring game pieces that they can have, especially in a game where the output of where their game pieces can go is completely random. Denying 2 of the cargo here was important enough, along with the defense, for them to not have an extra score, right? And the defense here is also pretty solid, right? These guys aren't doing a bad job at all, but this idea of just denying game pieces ends up coming around a lot, especially in games where you're able to collect your opponent game piece. Again, you can see 254 goes across, collects it, has 3 game pieces at one point, but because of the 3-second rule, they're able to just get away with it, right? And so I'm just going to move towards the end of the match here because I want to point out something that wasn't actually done, but I saw a decent bit of at Worlds this year, was that some teams, so if we look at the way that the climbs worked here, teams, again, were trying to optimize their climb. You wanted basically the most amount of robots to be on the highest rung possible, rung being this giant bar that you're hanging off of. And so what I saw some teams doing, you won't see it in this match, was they're basically getting their two of their robots were getting to the top rung, and the third robot would stay on this one until like the very last second, and then they'd move over to the next one. Because the way the rules were written were, if you're able to hang on to a rung for a certain amount of time, and you don't fall off, then you get the point scored, even if you do fall off after. So teams would end up hooking onto this one at the end, like swinging, maybe even causing a crash at the robots, but that was only after that time had passed. So even if they crashed to the ground, they'd still get the extra points from going from this rung to the next rung. The mid rung to the high rung is what they were called. So again, another example of looking at the rules, reading the exact descriptions of what the FRC is asking, and using those guidelines to your advantage. I think that's one of the biggest things that you can take away as well when you're looking at kickoff rules and stuff and designing robots is look at the exact wording of how rules are being said. And especially take a look at how First Always releases the Q&A, right? I think that's a really important tool to look at, especially if someone catches something that you think is really interesting, or you think that there's a way that a rule might not be intended to be written, then you can definitely ask those on there. It's a really important resource. I think that all teams should be looking at, or at least considering, every time that they make an update. That is all for this video. Thank you guys for supporting the channel throughout the entire season. It's been amazing being able to do this. Thank you guys so much for that. And the next time I'll be posting will be for the kickoff next year. So happy holidays for everyone who celebrates, and have a lovely day.